Welcome to the Journal of the Southwest Radio Hour. I'm Pat Schwartz, and today's episode features Beverly Elliott, Executive Director of the African American Museum of Southern Arizona, whose offices and exhibits are located at the University of Arizona campus in Tucson. This episode gives us kind of a museum tour. Elliott gives us some background on the institution, which is the first of its kind in the state, while walking listeners through its unique collection that showcases African American history in this region and connects visitors with the indelible impact Black communities have long had on the culture, politics, art, and landscapes of Southern Arizona. Even if, as our host discusses, this history has been left out of many of our textbooks and narratives. During this episode's transitions, you'll hear the music of composer Ulysses S. Kay, a seminal American composer and musician born in Tucson in 1917. A graduate of Tucson High and then of U of A, Kay was trained in piano, violin, and saxophone, though he picked up a few other instruments such as the flute and the piccolo during his time in the U.S. Navy Band during World War II. Over his storied career, Kay wrote numerous acclaimed symphonies, choral compositions, and operas which helped define the neoclassical music genre of the 20th century. The African American Museum of Southern Arizona is a place to learn more about Kay, and about other Black local artists of all disciplines. You can find more information in the show notes about the recordings we use of Kay's pieces, which are still performed all over the world today. The first pieces you'll hear are snippets from his Sonata for Bassoon and Piano, composed in 1941. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a full short piece from Kay's Six Dances for String Orchestra, a waltz composed in 1954. Now we join Beverly Elliott for a tour of the museum.
My name is Beverly Elliott, and I'm going to spell that because I don't spell it the normal way. It's Beverely, and Elliott is two L's and two T's, so Elliott. So a lot of people will cut that off as well. And I'm the Executive Director for the African American Museum of Southern Arizona. We had our grand opening in January of last year, January 14th of 2023. So we've only been open about a year and a half. But we had put in quite a few months prior to that, just putting things together, about a year before we actually opened. When we opened the museum on that January 14th day, we were told, because I've checked with other museums, what's the process? I'm definitely not going to just go out there and think I know what I'm doing. And they said, you'll probably have about 70 or 80 people, stay open for a couple hours. That's all you probably need to do. And I'm thinking, okay, that's great. Well, we put balloons and did our thing, and we're here at like 9 in the morning for a 10 o'clock opening, and all of a sudden there's a line of people. Well, that day we had 362 people come through this museum. Well, during the pandemic, my husband and I, we have 4 children, and we had a daughter who had moved back to Tucson. She moved back right before the pandemic, and she had a kindergartner and a 3rd grader. And as a retired educator at the time, she wanted me to come over and help with the children. So this kindergartner, oh boy, to get them to sit down in front of a laptop all of a sudden, and they've been running around and having breaks every 15 or 20 minutes at school, was quite a task. Well, he rolled into 1st grade. He had an assignment from his 1st grade teacher during Black History Month to please do a report on a famous African American. So he's looking up all the names that most people know, Martin Luther King or W.E.B. Du Bois. Well, he picked Phyllis Wheatley, which most people don't know, and she was a famous poet. And so he'd overheard me talk a lot about Black history and different things, and he looked at me and said, well, where can I find a museum or a place where I can go where I can find the history of people that look like me here in Southern Arizona? So I checked around and came back saying there was not an African American museum in the state of Arizona. We had the George Washington Carver Museum that is not open. They've tried and they're still working on it. And the Dunbar Coalition, I believe it's Pavilion, that's here in Tucson. But they're not considered museums. And so I had to tell him there wasn't one. He was a little upset, and of course, out of the mouth of a 7-year-old, he goes, "Do you mean there were no black people here before us?" No, that's not exactly the way it works. And he said, "I think you should start a museum, and I'll help you." And he has been here helping every step of the way. So very proud of him, and he inspired me, and I love history, to move forward and start the museum. Lots of webinars, lots of mentors, and lots of information came my way. And luckily I was retired and nobody was doing anything. It was a pandemic, so I had plenty of time to study. Once we put the word out to the African American community through churches and through friends and different African American groups, the NAACP, the Tucson chapter of the Lynx, people started hearing about that we were going to start this museum. And people started calling us and just donating items. So one of the first exhibitions that we have is the Buffalo Soldiers. And we received those 5 amazing prints from a gentleman named Frank Bothwell, who was a soldier at Fort Huachuca. And he came out here and just became very interested in the history of Buffalo Soldiers. So he actually had these in his home after he retired, but he said they were in the closet. He said, "Nobody's going to see these. They're just sitting here." And it was interesting because he asked me to meet him at a McDonald's off of I-10. Yeah, to pick it up. So that's the way the first one started, and it was kind of our first exhibit. And he handed it to me just like that. He just kind of was throwing them in my trunk. They weren't in boxes. I'm trying to follow proper museum protocol and get him to sign papers and take pictures of them. And that, a gentleman named Dr. Michael Ings, who's also a historian, had a connection, and he provided us with a mannequin that has a replica of a uniform that a Buffalo soldier was wearing in the 1860s, 1870s, which is made out of wool. Pretty warm. Yes, we also had some other information where I guess maybe people want to come in. That's nice. But we also got some information that there's a Buffalo Soldier memorial that's here. A gentleman named John Covington helped to put that together through the Buffalo Soldier chapter that is in Southern area. Well, it's called the GSAAC. So we kind of started collaborating with them somewhat, and then we ended up getting a lot more of information on Buffalo Soldiers, which was probably our biggest one. We moved from there to Quincy Douglas, which the Quincy Douglas Library and Center is also actually where the Buffalo Soldier Memorial is. And Quincy Douglas is African American female who had a lot to do with starting what was called lifts. Back in the day, anything south of 22nd Street was pretty much farms and dirt roads. And that's where, for redlining, that's where a lot of African American folks lived during that time. That's where Quincy Douglas lived, along with a lady named Margaret Campbell. And Margaret was an educated woman, a school teacher, and she and Quincy Douglas were friends, so she would write up where people needed to be on what corner at what time for the vans to pick them up, and then where you needed to be to get picked up for work, and also helping to feed seniors because they couldn't get out. Let's say it's the monsoon. How on earth are you going to walk through that dirt to get to where you need to do to buy food? So that was also a very big help to her community. So that's why there's a library named in her honor.
Quincy Bell Sims came to Tucson from Chickasha Territory in the early 1930s to work as a domestic laborer. Here, she met her husband Angelo Douglas and raised 3 kids in South Tucson. In 1964, Quincy suffered a stroke that affected her mobility. Frustrated at the new limitations on her independence because she didn't drive, she sought a solution to the barriers she and other non-drivers faced in getting around the city. Working with Margaret Campbell, she received a seed grant from the Tucson Committee for Economic Opportunity in order to launch the LIFTS program, LIFTS, which stands for Low Income Free Transportation Service. The successful service was eventually taken over by the city and is today known as Sunvan. Douglas advocated for making transportation free for people with disabilities, young people, and low-income riders. She was also active in getting neighborhood centers, sidewalks, streetlights, and other programs into South Tucson before she died in 1986. In the 1970s, the Quincy Douglas Recreation Center in Silver Lake Park was named after her, followed by a library that now also bears her name. Though I've spent many an afternoon in that library, and a fair amount of my time advocating for free and accessible transit in Tucson, I hadn't heard of this or a lot of these stories.
And that's one of the things we ask. We've been asked to get a bell and it will have a counter on it. Every time someone says, I didn't know that, we're going to ring the bell. We'll see how many dings we get. There's also a gentleman named Albert Randall who worked at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. He was a Top Gun back in the 60s and 70s. And he was responsible for the United States military service and first responders wearing an American flag on your sleeve. He actually put together a patch, which we do have the original patch, of a Confederate flag with a black power fist. Because before that idea was there, you could put anything you wanted on your sleeves. You could put your mother's name, you could put a bad word, you could put swastikas, as he said, were there, and various other. He was responsible for changing that around. We've also done some collaboration with Mission Gardens, and people may not know this, but that's a 4,000-year-old garden. And just recently, in the last couple of years, they have a garden called Africa in America. It's shaped like the continent of Africa, but in that garden, you will find fruits, vegetables, as well as herbs that came from Africa that enslaved people hid in their bodies or hid in their hair. They hid the seeds. And so if you go out there, you'll find all types of amazing fruits and vegetables, herbs that were brought here from Africa. Greens, black-eyed peas, broccoli, okra. People didn't know those were actually all grown in Africa. We were fortunate enough to be there for the inauguration and the opening of the garden, but we wrote a grant that provided 4th and 5th graders from Booth-Fickett, K-8, a bus of children that got to go out to Mission Gardens. But before they went, the museum we purchased planters, and the kids got to decorate them. They had to learn about companion planting, which is the science part of that, and they did that out at the garden. We had a chef there who scrambled eggs and showed them how to put the spinach that they were going to be growing in their planters, along with cilantro and onions. So that was a fun educational project, and we'll probably continue to work with Mission Garden. Yeah. We also have a slave code quilt, which is on this wall over here, and but that slave code quilt was made by a woman named Cora Ferris, grew up in Kentucky. Her grandfather, now she's in her 90s, but her great-grandfather was an enslaved man. And they worked in the home, and they were seamstresses and sewers. So her grandfather said that there was this code that was based on the patterns on a quilt that would help enslaved people. It was kind of like a GPS. So they would wash the quilt, but they'd hear that someone is a runaway slave, and they would hang out whichever quilt would give them an idea. You can stay here. That would be a log cabin. There's flying geese. Keep going. Or there's a wagon wheel. Hang around. We'll get you a ride. So she made an educational quilt for us that has all of those patterns on it. And she made it actually about in 2000, along with amazing video that helps us to educate kids about it. And we have inspired, I can't tell you how many people who are quilters or wannabe quilters who have called and said, I'm going to make one. That's been wonderful. We have Dunbar, of course. Dunbar is the gem in our city with so much African-American history. And we've interviewed Barbara Lewis, who is their historian. And she has been so gracious in sharing some of the history at Dunbar. But of course, we encourage you to go to Dunbar to learn more. But to share with us that the school was an integrated school. And then in 1913, when they said, black children and white children can't go to school together. So then it became separated in 1913. And we also have some of the pictures of some of the amazing classes that they had, graduating classes, and some of the events that went on at Dunbar, because it was kind of the hub, just like black churches were back in the day, but it was a hub for information. It was a community center for the children. And so we even have a couple of picture of famous people that stopped at Dunbar that they shared with us.
The Paul Laurence Dunbar School opened on West 2nd Street in Midtown Tucson in 1912 as a segregated elementary and middle school. Organizing by Black Tucson families garnered support for the severely under-resourced facility, and the Dunbar became an important community gathering place for several generations. When Arizona finally ended segregation in 1951, the integrated school was renamed after local educator John Spring. State legislation to end segregation wasn't enough to change reality on the ground. In 1974, the NAACP and Tucson families filed a lawsuit against TUSD, contending that school districts were being gerrymandered, and that the district was not providing equal education opportunities to all children of all races and ethnicities. In 1978, TUSD received a desegregation order and new requirements to rectify demographic imbalances at its schools, as well as changes to discipline and transportation programs. Actually, this case from the 1970s has been in the news again recently. I'll put some more information in the show notes, but plaintiffs led by Black and Mexican American families in Tucson remain concerned about segregation in TUSD schools today and are still fighting for equity in resources and education for all children. As for the Dunbar, the school closed the same year the desegregation order first came down. Then, in 1995, a group of advocates formed the Dunbar Coalition and bought the school building in order to create the Dunbar Pavilion, an African American arts and culture center. Today, the Dunbar is home to several arts, education, and entrepreneurial projects, and it preserves the history and legacy of the Dunbar Spring neighborhood in Tucson.
Fred Snowden was the first African-American coach in an NC2A Division I major school in the United States, and he was at the University of Arizona. Most people probably think, oh, it's probably Detroit or Los Angeles or DC. No, Tucson. So we can, of course, tout that quite proudly. He came from the University of Michigan, where he was actually the first African-American man ever hired as an assistant coach. And they brought him out here to be a head coach in 1972. He did encounter a little bit of racism, and along with that, was not able to build a home where he wanted to. Once again, redlining. However, the mayor at the time, I believe his name was Mayor Corbett, helped him to purchase a home. And his daughter, Stacy Snowden, she came and did a fireside chat for us. And in that chat, her father passed away in 1993, but in that chat, she talks about growing up here and being completely afraid for several years, bomb threats, kidnapping threats. She said the first year they stayed probably in hotels, that they bounced around in hotels more than they stayed in their home once their home was ready. But at the same time, he was quite revered in Tucson. He went from Bear Down Gym that holds 3,000 people to doing sellout crowds at McHale Center where there are 14,000 people. And so we're very proud that Stacy has shared with us several of his awards. Actually, we had Bill Walton here about a year ago, and he helped to publicize not just the museum, but he also wanted us to know we have letters from his coach, the famous coach John Wooden from UCLA. He sent letters of encouragement to Fred Snowden, John Wooden did, to stay on his job. He knew what was kind of going on. There were a couple of different games and different things where they just weren't, his teams weren't treated fairly. But he was very encouraging, along with several other coaches, that, stayed the course. And he did a great job. He was inducted into the U of A Sports Hall of Fame. So he definitely made an impact. And as far as some of our social justice initiatives, we have quite a few. One, of course, we are kind of in that battle with our Jewish brothers and sisters against anti-Semitism. We know that there were synagogues that have been desecrated. There's also been African-American museums and churches that have gone through the same thing. So we absolutely understand, want to let them know we're in support of them. The other couple that we have, one was the Crown Act, and the Crown Act, it stands as an acronym for Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair. And one of the things we did is we had a QR code up, and we asked people if they scanned that code, it would go to our senators and to Governor Katie Hobbs to make sure that we want her to sign that executive order to make legislation to pass for the Crown Act. March 17th, we were in Phoenix and standing with the governor as she signed the Crown Act. We were very proud to be a part of that. We were also, before we even opened in 2021, this gentleman contacted us when he found out we were trying to become established. He had been very involved with the Anti-Lynching Act, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, and he was doing this painting. He wanted us to make sure we had the painting here when we opened, and we did. And he, of course, got us involved with how do we get this legislation passed. We once again were writing letters, and President Biden signed that as well. So we feel like we've been involved in two big ones in 18 months or so we're really proud of that. We're also working with Pima County on the Black and Brown Health Fair. We've done that 2 years in a row, where they set up either a park or a community center. We ask Black and brown people and anybody else who wants to come to come and get your blood pressure checked, your ears, your eyes, and helping you out with any problems that they may see, referring you to physicians. So we're working on some of those healthcare disparities that we know that are out there. That's another one of our initiatives. Getting out the vote. We're not telling you how to vote. We're just asking you to please go vote. It was especially for African Americans, it was a long trek before that could even happen. As a matter of fact, there's a story about a gentleman who served in World War II. His last name was Snipes. That's all I can remember. I'm sorry. But in 1946, he decided to go and vote. He was in Mississippi. They let him vote, and they pulled his vote, of course. The next day, a mob shot him in the back. He died about 3 days later. So we know, even though we have this right, that there's always these things. And that was, of course, during Jim Crow era. But we know that there are people out there who are going to discourage you not to vote. So we just want people to say, get your voice heard, pick somebody, It took us a long time to get the right to vote. So please go out there and vote. So that's one of our initiatives. And our next initiative is that we're working on right now is to raise enough funds to have a bench put into the Women's Plaza of Honor in honor of Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is a Supreme Court Justice, female. We are pretty close to reaching our goal, and I, being very bold as I am, have invited her to come, hopefully next year. But those are some of our initiatives and some of our exhibitions that we have. Some of the grants that we've worked on, the one in particular we worked on before we even opened also with Dr. Jason Jurjevich, was the MRC grant, which is Mapping Racist Covenants. And we have an advisory board, and on that advisory board we have a lady who was born and raised here, and she's in her 70s, and then her husband, who moved here when he was maybe a 4 or 5 year old. Jason asked for a couple of people that I could have them help out with the grant and talk about their experiences, since I didn't grow up here. And they did, and they were very involved with the projects. And Delano Price has been amazing at supporting Jason and I through the grant. But in finding out how many different covenants are still out there and restrictions, it's a little bit crazy that there's still about 20 CCNRs that are out there. So one of the things we did is we took it to, of course, the governor. And it was House Bill 1432, and it's just passed recently in the last month or so. We're really excited to see that. However, one of the things that we as the museum are petitioning for is not for homeowners to wipe it out. So I've met with a couple of different people. Dana Adler, who's with the Jewish Community Center. There's a gentleman here in town, Peter Williams, and the three of us met, and what we're coming up with is a way for us to offer options. One, where there's a strike line through it, and it has a date. So when people look at it, they go, oh, back in 2001, I couldn't live here. Or there might be one where we circle it and highlight it, and we have a date, but it remains there without a strike through. So we're putting together right now how we would like the governor to put that information out, because that's one of the things as African Americans we feel there's so much that's been erased. There's so much that hasn't been included. You read your history books, and even if you study Arizona history, there's very little about Buffalo Soldiers when they actually were at Camp Little, Camp Naco, Fort Lowell, and you're not going to see that anywhere in a history book, but it's Arizona history.
If you're interested in learning more about the Mapping Racist Covenants project that the museum worked on, JSW did an episode on the research effort and the remaining racist covenants, conditions, and restrictions in Tucson neighborhoods as part of this history series in July 2024. The MRC project is one example of how Southern Arizona residents have worked with institutions like the museum and university researchers to take part in the keeping and understanding of local history. Since opening the museum, Elliott and her team have sourced most of the collection from longtime residents, willing to share their family's stories and even heirlooms to better tell the Tucson story.
Most people were not archiving anything. They were mostly just keeping stuff in their closets or, in a trunk. And then what we have done is I followed museum protocol. I've worked with the University Arizona Museum of Art. So anytime we brought anything in, we document that right away. We make sure that the person signs off on it, whether it's a loan or whether it's a deed of gift. So yeah, and we try to make sure people understand that. We got certified already through the Arizona Historical Society and the American Association of State and Local History. So we've received a certificate of excellence. And then as far as oral histories, we've been getting quite a few people calling saying, hey, my friend's great aunt is 92 and she was born and raised here, and we go to them. And so we were at churches during the pandemic, and they opened their church up and just let us film. It's just us and 2 cameras and person sitting over there. You take your mask off, and we're all way back here. So we started actually with oral histories. That was the very first thing that we did. So yeah, for the most part, Southern Arizona, we stick pretty close to our mission. Although I was in Phoenix yesterday for this breakfast, and they basically want me to help them start a museum up there, which will be pretty interesting. It's been very nice that we're getting the publicity that we're getting. So collaboration is extremely important for us, and not just with other historical places, but with businesses and organizations. We have a partnership with Arizona Theater Company as well as Broadway on Tucson. So we had MJ the Musical Group here. And they were amazing. I mean, they were dancing, and I don't think this place knew what was going on. It was not history. We were right there. But they were singing some old Motown songs from the MJ the Musical. We also had Ain't Too Proud, which was another one of Broadway on Tucson's productions, and they did all the Temptation songs. We just went to, during Juneteenth, one of the Juneteenth festivals committee put together, along with a dance group. It's called Dancing in the Streets. Joey Rogers himself, a ballet artist, brought Black Cinderella to, it was amazing. So those are the kind of things that we are collaborating with, like for the Juneteenth festival. A couple of things that are upcoming. We're going to have a couple of new exhibits here. We're doing one that's called Music, Part of the Soul of Our Culture. And it will have Marian Anderson, who was a contralto opera singer who was at Dunbar, by the way. She stopped in at Dunbar, but of course she sang on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with 75,000 people back in 1939, which was probably the biggest concert ever, up until, of course, Taylor Swift and Beyonce and those people. And then we also are, a part of that exhibit will be a gentleman named Harvey Mason, who played basketball for Lute Olson, but he is a musician. And Harvey Mason is now the president of the Grammys. We do have an upcoming event. We're doing a tea in collaboration with Pima Community College Fine Arts in October. We have a website, aamsaz.org. And we ask you to go to the website. You can contact me through email that way. But we also have a pull-down area that says you want to donate something.
All right.
Contact us on the website. We look forward to working with you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.